get started, I wanted to show you a couple of things that might be helpful. This picture of Chuck Close has a lot of interesting texture. The hair in particular can be a little challenging, so I'm going to show you a couple of things that you should keep in mind whether you're doing old Chuck Close or if you're making a portrait of somebody else. In your sketchbook, go ahead and open up to a page and make 3 squares. You can see these squares are about 2 finger widths by 2 finger width. Now, using your 6B pencil, go ahead and shade the box from, let's say the top left corner is at 100%. And the bottom right hand corner is something like 40%. Now remember, when you're shading, you don't have to press so hard that you dent the paper. You can always come back and add multiple layers in order to get the value that you're trying to achieve. Especially if you are trying to achieve a very dark value, it's helpful to do that using multiple layers. So here I have basically 40% across the whole square. But I want to get this top corner to be much, much darker. So by going over it multiple times, but with lines that are very close to each other so that the shading has a nice ombre effect. This is really important because there's so many places that are in shade and then gently come out of shade that you need to be able to make a nice smooth transition. We don't want any rainbows in this situation. Just a beautiful ombre from dark to light. In this case, light is still pretty dark. So that's from 100% to 40% with a smooth transition. Now if we go from 40% down to 10%, let's see what happens there. So we're trying to achieve a nice smooth transition from our darker area to our lighter area. Take a Q-tip and we're going to blend from light to dark in each of these. It's really important to remember that you want to start with the 10% or your lightest area with a clean Q-tip, blending from there and then moving across to the darker area. Now you don't want to move back into your 10% because you'll drag your extra graphite into your 10% and you'll lose that lightness. However, since we went from 10 to 40 and now we're going 40 to 100, we can just bring our same Q-tip up and gently blend so that we have really beautiful shading. Now down here in the bottom one, we want to go from 0% to 10%. And if we look at our grayscale value finder, 10% is really light, and so 0% has to be the color of the paper. So that is as if we're not putting anything on the paper at all. So to get this 10%, you might be able to do a little bit of shading, but check it out. We already have some graphite on our Q-tip. So we could just use that graphite, and it's pretty close to 10%. And now as we move toward the 0%, we just have less pressure on our Q-tip so that we have a very smooth transition from 10% down to 0%. There's one more thing that I'd like to show you, and that is where you have hair. In this case, Chuck Close has eyebrows and he has this beard, and that can be really tricky. So one of the things that you can do is squint your eyes, and if you don't see it, then don't draw it. So for instance, even though if I look really closely, I see some of these wrinkles, I don't have to draw every single wrinkle. If I squint my eyes and it goes away, then it's too detailed. I don't have to do it. But you can do this thing called deductive and additive values. And that is when you both use the eraser to take away graphite and you use your pencil to add graphite. Say, for instance, in his eyebrows, there's some white hairs, and then there's these really dark hairs. And then there's the skin that's underneath them. So, for instance, we're going to look at this 10% to 40% square. And if we wanted to try to get these light hairs to show up, and what we can do is take our eraser and then just swipe across. And this is deductive. Now, the good and the bad is that our eraser is great at lightening the value, but it is only as thin as the eraser is itself. So it might be that these aren't as thin as the white hairs that we can see here. So we might have to come back in and shape those just a little bit so that it's a little bit more like what we're looking at here. And then the other side of that is additive. So now we can use our pencil and we can go ahead and looking at those hairs and the shape that those hairs make, we can start to get a sense of those eyebrows. Using deductive and additive approaches with our graphite. So that's starting to look pretty close. And of course, this area under here is super dark. So if it's dark in our image, then it's going to be dark on our artwork. Okay, so deductive means using the eraser to lighten areas, and additive means using graphite to get darker values. So I hope this helps as you proceed with your portrait. Good morning. Today we are going to do the project that has historically been the favorite among 7th and 8th grade students. So let's get started. We have a portrait of Chuck Close when he was young and a portrait of Chuck Close when he was old. I know you have the option of recreating this portrait, either one of these or possibly one of your own choosing. I'm going to use the old Chuck Close as an example to get you started, but the process is exactly the same. To begin with, what we need to do is have a grid that is drawn on top of our original reference image. Now, all we would need to do in order to make that happen is to use our proportion divider and make our grid by dividing the side and the tops into a grid. I know you know how to do that, and in the interest of saving time, I have already done that for you. Now we need to take our mixed media paper, one sheet, and create a grid on the mixed media paper. I did size the photograph so that it is the same size as your mixed media pad, and that's just for convenience. But remember, we can always use a piece of paper that is many times bigger than the original image or smaller if we want, as long as the height and width is proportional to the photocopy. So I'm going to make a grid that matches the grid on my photocopy. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to use my proportion divider, and I'm going to go ahead and divide it in the way that I'm used to, which is dividing the short end into 3 segments and the long end into 4 segments. And then I'll be able to subdivide each of those segments half again, so that I end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares down, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares across. You already know how to do this, but if you would like to watch, feel free to, and if you want to skip ahead, that's fine too. Okay, so we're going to look at our cheat sheet, and we can see that in order to divide the long section into fourths, we're going to put our little button in the 1, 2, 3 third hole from the short end. 1, 2, 3. There we go. This is going to give us quarters. So I can take my long end, lay it down. Really be careful. Make sure that those long points are touching at each corner, and then go ahead and subdivide into 4 segments. It should be perfectly 4. Do the same at the bottom, and be very, very careful as you are creating your grid. If you need to go back and make a change, then do that. If the grid is off, then your proportions will be off, and the only reason that we use the grid is because it helps us with the proportions. Now, I seem to have misplaced my HB pencil, so I'm using, this one needs to be redone, just a mechanical pencil. It says number 2 on it, and any pencil that says number 2 on it is an HB pencil. So that's an easy thing to remember. Most of the pencils that you use that are just daily pencils for all of your academic classes have the word number 2 on them, and that also means that it's an HB pencil. Remember that we're trying to make our lines super light. I'm making them a little heavier than I normally would so that you can see them on the screen. But the lighter that they are, the easier it's going to be to erase. Now I'm breaking my segments into thirds, so I need to change my button to the 1, 2, 3, 4th position. One, two, three, 4. Now you might be wondering why we can't just subdivide a segment into 8ths and into 6ths, but if I look at my cheat sheet, it doesn't look like I have a button that works for 8ths or for 6ths. So I'm going to divide them into thirds and fourths and then subdivide those in half. Okay. Put down my corners, flip it over, making sure not to move or change the width of my pointers. Double check that. Yep. Move down to the bottom. Double check. Perfect. Using any kind of straight edge, in this case, my Craypaw Oil Pastels is serving as my straight edge in order to help me get the grid. Now I have 3 across and 4 down. What I need is, if you look at it this direction, 6 across and 8 down. So I'm going to subdivide each of these segments in half. If I look at my half indicator, my button will be on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the 6th spot. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6. I think it would have been really helpful if the company that manufactured this tool had actually labeled each of these, but it is what it is. Okay, so now my long segments should be able to point to any of these squares, and they should all be the same. If I've done it right, then they should all be actual squares, which means that the long tips are pointing corner to corner of any of the squares, and the short tips will be halfway marks. So halfway mark, and I can even come all the way down here. I can come down here. Okay. Again, drawing lightly. You want to draw more lightly than I am. Flip it around. My measurements should be the same, corner to corner, and it is. Flip it around and find my halfway marks. Okay. Great. And it looks like I had a little bit of oil pastel on the bottom of my box. I'm just going to go ahead and try to erase it as much as I can now. And if something like that happens to you and it bothers you, you can definitely start over with your grid. I tend to be a little bit of a messy artist, and I don't know, things like that just don't bother me. So I'm going to leave it just as is. Now what I'd like for you to do is to go ahead and tape your gridded paper into your sketchbook. We're going to be working on this for multiple days, so this is just going to help you keep track of the gridded numbers and letters. So you'll need some tape. I'm just going to use 4 pieces, put them in the corners. Part of the reason I'm putting them in the corners is because I can see in this corner, there's no drawing. There's same thing over here and same thing down here. And I'm going to go ahead and put a fourth one down in the bottom left corner. I think I'll be able to work with that. The next thing I'm going to do is write the numbers and letters that correspond with my gridded photocopy. And I'm going to write those in my book. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And the same thing down here. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then the letters down the side. A, B, C, D, E, and F. And the same thing on this side. We're going to do Chuck Close's grid technique, and they work square by square. So in order to do that, we're going to take our picture of Chuck or whoever your artist is that you're looking at, and we're going to put down 2 pieces of paper to block out everything except for the square that we're working on. So we're working on the A1 square, and this makes it really easy to see the shape that's in that square and to reproduce it. So now I'm in the A1 box, and I'm going to go ahead and come down and make this little bubble and that little leg out there. Now we have the shape. We're going to go ahead and do the shading. This is very dark. If you actually look at your value scale, then you can tell that it is the darkest of darks. So we're going to go ahead and make it very dark. We're just doing that little shape and the values that we see in that A1 box. Now we're going to move to the A2 box, moving our pieces of paper over so that it blocks out everything except for A2. Now this is very interesting. It is mostly dark, but it does have these light strands in here, and I'm going to show you how you can do that. So you can go ahead and do some of your wonderful shading. Remember, shading is just making lines right next to each other. You don't have to shade super dark. The first time you can layer multiple layers of graphite. The more careful you are with the shading, the better it's going to look. Keep all those lines going in the same direction. Make it nice and dark. Nice and dark. And it's just going to blend in with the shape that we shaded in the A1 box. Now you can come back with your eraser, especially if you have an eraser that has a nice tip to it. And I don't know if you can see from where you are. I'll zoom in. But these little lines are really light and they're organic. They're not straight and they're not predictable. They're a little bit random. You can do what's called a deductive technique, where you take your eraser, looking at where those light lines are, you can erase out. And if it gets so that it's not really doing a very good job of erasing, it just means that your eraser is dirty. So then you can come back in. Start to lay in some of those shapes. Now, what I have here is not very close to what I see here, so I'm going to come back in and try to reshape these negative spaces so that they look more like what I'm seeing. I'm not even sure what those things are, but what I do know is that they are a little bit more random. They're a little bit lighter. And I can both adjust my darks so that they appear, so that those lights appear to be closer to what I see. And this is starting to get there. All right, let's move on. Moving right over to the 3A box. I'm carefully aligning my paper. And ooh, this is going to be interesting. The first thing I'm going to do is to find my shapes. So here's a line that starts and stops on either side and has this gentle curve. Here's a line that starts halfway down and ends a little bit more than halfway up. So up here, and has another gentle curve. Now, it is human nature to try to think about what you're drawing and try to draw it so that it looks like what you think it looks like. But just try to quiet that voice in your head. Just look for shapes and values. So my value extends over here. And it's quite dark, and then it comes to a medium. So I can say that it's probably 100% on the far end, maybe 90% on the far end, and then it comes to maybe a 50% here halfway across. And then this line too, this is more than just a line. There's a little bit of shading above it, something like that. And then down here, we have more of this very, very dark down in the corner. And then it goes to a medium. And I'm going to give myself a little bit of a shape that's kind of containing these hairs. And give myself the base value. The base value is what I see underneath those little white highlights. Trying to preserve some of those white highlights. And this is also where I love to use a Q-tip. Anything that is a value of 20% or less, even 30% or less, doesn't need a lot of pencil graphite. It's almost easier to kind of use some graphite that's on a Q-tip. So by blending in my darks, then when I get over here to the area that's only like 10-20% dark, then I can just use my my Q-tip that has graphite on it and then blend it like that. I can see that that light actually went down into my 2, so I'm going to come in here and do a little deductive in my 2, and already that looks better. It may even have come over here a little bit. So again, a little bit of deductive. All right. That looks pretty good. I'm going to move on to the 4A. This line extends down at a maybe 45-degree angle, and it almost touches but doesn't touch, just south of the halfway point, so about here. So it's dark and then it lightens up. This line just goes through just a little bit. It's pretty dark, and then it lightens up. And again, this area is very, very light. So instead of actually shading with my pencil, I'm just going to use my Q-tip that already has some value on it, and just softly put in some of that value so that it reads at 20%. Okay, now we're going to move on to our A5. I can see that there's this line up here that starts in my 4. It's pretty dark, and then curves up, something like that. There's another line here that starts maybe just above the halfway point and kind of comes in like that. And the rest of it, if I look really closely, I can probably see his pores and so forth. But if you don't see it when you when you kind of like squint your eyes, if you don't see it when you squint your eyes, then I don't worry about it. It looks like this little area that's a little bit darker. And so I'm just going to add just the littlest bit of a darker shape in there. It doesn't take very much graphite at all in order to make it darker if you're using your 6B. Okay, now we're on to our A6. I'm going to extend this line over. And this eyebrow is coming up. Something like that. Again, it's very light. It's probably 20%, maybe even between 10 and 20%. So instead of shading it with my pencil, I'm just going to use graphite that's on my Q-tip and softly blend like that. Coming over to my 7A. Ooh, these are cool lines. Oh my gosh, I love this. Okay, so the one that was dragging across the 6 comes to the 7 and then down about a quarter of the way off of the edge. So it comes here and then down. And it's a little thicker. So where it's heavier, where it's thicker, I'm going to come in and add that. And then this line here comes from the corner, bends down and just beside that first line. Thinner in this area, much heavier up here. Quality of line, trying to make the quality of line consistent with what I see. There's one that comes off just a little to the right of half, comes down and disappears as if it's heading toward the halfway mark. Heavier, and then disappears. And then this one up here goes across. These are great lines. And then I can see that there's a little loopy loop here. And it comes up. This one kind of comes up and then fades. All of these wonderful forehead wrinkles. Makes so interesting. And I'm using my Q-tip to soften those lines a little bit. And I'm picking up some graphite so that I can give the skin that value, which is about 15%. All right, coming over to A8. Nice easy line here. I can see it starts at the top at about a quarter of the way over and ends just a little further over at the end, on the bottom, and there's just this very slight edge to it. Okay. Now that I've gone all the way across the top, I can come back to my B1 box. And now I'm working in B1. It sometimes helps to have the grid such that it is perfectly below your drawing so that you don't get confused. And I can see where I crossed. So I can see here, and it bubbles out, has a little bubble, and then up and down, and it ends just to the right of that bottom corner. So this is where it ends. This is where it bubbles out. This is bubbles again, and does something like that. Now this is all very dark except for this light shape in here. I don't know what that is. I'm going to go ahead and put in that shape so that I can avoid drawing over it. And I'm going to go ahead and add my dark value. Just working in that one box. Okay, now I can take my Q-tip, gently blend that, and I can look at this light shape. What value is it? It looks like it's 10%. So if I just gently go over this, then it kind of blends it to 10%.